The morning Sarah Whitmore collapsed face first into the dry Texas soil, she had been awake for 23 hours straight, and the sun overhead felt like the devil's own furnace pressing down on her shoulders. She had inherited the 60-acre farm outside of San Antonio in the spring of 1878, when her father succumbed to pneumonia and her brother died in a mining accident within the same terrible month. At 22 years old, Sarah found herself alone with land that demanded constant attention, crops that needed planting, and a stubborn mule named Jefferson, who seemed determined to make every task twice as difficult as it needed to be. The neighbors had offered their condolences, but little else. A woman working a farm alone was viewed with a mixture of pity and disapproval, as though her very existence challenged the natural order of things. She had refused 3 marriage proposals from men who looked at her land with more interest than they ever showed her face. The cotton needed planting, and Sarah had spent the previous day repairing the plow that her father had used for 15 years. The metal had cracked along a seam, and she had worked through the night by lamplight, heating and hammering until her hands blistered and bled. She had managed a poor repair job, but it would hold long enough to finish the south field. It had to hold. If she did not get the cotton in the ground within the week, she would miss the growing season entirely, and without a crop to sell, she would lose everything before winter arrived. Jefferson had been particularly ornery that morning, refusing to take the harness until Sarah bribed him with the last of the oats she had been saving. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees when she finally got the mule hitched to the plow, and by noon, the air shimmered with heat that rose from the cracked earth in visible waves. Sarah had worn her father's old hat, the brim wide enough to provide some shade, but the sun found every exposed inch of her skin and burned it red and raw. She should have stopped. She should have taken shelter during the hottest part of the day like any sensible person would have done. But Sarah could see the dark clouds building on the western horizon, and she knew that if the rains came before she finished plowing, the ground would turn to mud and she would lose another week waiting for it to dry. Every day mattered. Every hour counted. She pushed forward, gripping the plow handles until her palms screamed in protest, guiding Jefferson down one furrow and back up another, breathing dust and feeling the world tilt slightly with each step. The last thing she remembered was thinking that the horizon looked strange, like it was rising up to meet her. And then the ground rushed forward and everything went black. Thomas McKenna had been riding the fence line of the neighboring ranch when he saw the woman fall. He had noticed her earlier, a small figure hunched behind a plow in the distance, and had thought it odd that anyone would be working in such heat. Most of the ranch hands on the property where he worked had taken shelter in the barn, playing cards and waiting for the temperature to drop below hellish. Thomas had volunteered to check the southern fence because he preferred solitude to the constant ribbing and rough humor of the bunkhouse. At 26, he had spent 8 years working cattle ranches across Texas, moving from place to place whenever restlessness overtook him, never staying long enough to put down roots. He spurred his horse into a gallop the moment he saw her collapse, covering the distance between them in less than a minute. Jefferson the mule had stopped walking and stood statue still in the harness, apparently unconcerned that his owner lay motionless in the dirt. Thomas swung down from his saddle and dropped to his knees beside the woman, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her face was flushed bright red, her skin burning to the touch, and for one terrible moment he thought she might already be dead. Then he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest and felt a surge of relief so powerful it left him momentarily dizzy. He scooped her into his arms, startled by how light she felt, how fragile, and carried her toward the only shade visible anywhere in the flat expanse of farmland. A scraggly mesquite tree stood about 40 yards from where she had fallen, its twisted branches providing a patch of shadow barely large enough for 2 people. Thomas laid her down gently, then ran back to his horse for his canteen. He knelt beside her and carefully trickled water over her forehead, her temples, the back of her neck. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Thomas wet his bandana and laid it across her forehead, then lifted her head slightly and pressed the canteen to her lips. Most of the water ran down her chin, but a small amount made it into her mouth, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed reflexively. "Come on now," he said quietly, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. "Wake up for me." Minutes passed, like hours. Thomas kept trickling water over her skin, kept the wet bandana cool against her forehead, and gradually the angry flush began to fade from her cheeks. Her breathing deepened and steadied. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her eyes opened. They were green, Thomas noticed immediately, the color of new leaves in spring, startling against her sun-darkened skin. She stared up at him with confusion and something that might have been fear, trying to make sense of where she was and who was hovering over her. "Easy," Thomas said, putting a hand on her shoulder when she tried to sit up. "You fainted out there. Heat exhaustion, most likely. You need to stay still for a while." Sarah's memory came rushing back. The plow, the field, the desperate need to finish before the rains came. She struggled against his restraining hand, panic rising in her chest. "The plowing. I have to finish the plowing." "Ma'am, you are in no condition to be walking, let alone working a plow." "You do not understand." Sarah pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the way the world spun sickeningly around her. "The rains are coming, and if I do not get that field plowed and planted, I will lose everything. I have to finish." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, taking in the desperation in her eyes, the blisters on her hands, the sheer exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Then he looked out at the field, at the mule still standing patiently in the harness, at the barely 1/3 of the acreage that had been turned. He made a decision that surprised him even as he spoke the words. "Tell me what needs doing, and I will do it." Sarah stared at him as though he had spoken a foreign language. "What?" "The plowing. I will finish it for you. You stay here in the shade and drink water and do not move unless you absolutely have to. I will get that field turned before sundown." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I am offering." Thomas stood and settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I have worked cattle for 8 years, ma'am. I know my way around a plow. Your mule and I will get along just fine." Sarah wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that she could manage on her own, that she did not need help from a stranger, that accepting charity was the first step toward losing her independence entirely, but her body betrayed her. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her, and she would have fallen if Thomas had not caught her and eased her back down into the shade. "Stay," he said firmly, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. "I mean it." He left her there and walked back to where Jefferson waited. The mule eyed him with deep suspicion, but Thomas had a way with animals, and within a few minutes he had the plow moving again, cutting clean furrows through the hard earth. Sarah watched from beneath the mesquite tree, sipping water from the canteen he had left with her, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and frustration churning in her stomach. The afternoon crawled by. Thomas worked steadily, his shirt darkening with sweat, his muscles settling into the familiar rhythm of the plow. It was hard work, made harder by the relentless heat, but there was something satisfying about it too. Something honest and straightforward that appealed to him in a way that riding fence line never quite did. He could see progress with each pass across the field, could measure his accomplishment in the neat rows of turned earth spreading out behind him. Sarah drifted in and out of a light doze, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that she had stopped moving. When she woke fully, the sun had dropped considerably toward the western horizon, and the cowboy was still out there, still working more than halfway through the field now. She felt stronger, though her head still ached, and her skin felt tight and hot. She forced herself to drink more water, knowing that dehydration could kill as surely as a bullet. As the shadows lengthened, Thomas completed the final furrow and unhitched Jefferson from the plow. He walked the mule back toward the small barn he had spotted near the farmhouse, making sure the animal had water and feed before he returned to check on the woman beneath the mesquite tree. She was sitting up now, looking more alert, though still pale beneath her sunburn. "You finished it," Sarah said, and her voice came out rough with emotion. "You actually finished the whole field." "Told you I would." Thomas lowered himself to the ground beside her, grateful for the shade after hours in the sun. "That mule of yours has opinions about proper plowing technique, but we reached an understanding." Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "Jefferson has opinions about everything. He was my father's mule before he was mine." "Your father taught him well then, stubborn but steady." Thomas pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "I am Thomas McKenna, by the way. I work at the Morrison Ranch, just east of here." "Sarah Whitmore, this is my land." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you. I do not know what would have happened if you had not come along when you did." "You would have woken up eventually. Probably would have gone right back to plowing, too, if I know anything about stubborn farmers." "I am not a farmer by choice," Sarah said quietly. "I am a farmer by necessity. My father and brother died this spring, and this land is all I have left in the world. If I lose it, I have nowhere to go." Thomas heard the fear beneath her words, and something in his chest tightened. He had never known what it meant to have a place that mattered, to be tied to land and legacy. He had been drifting for so long that the idea of roots felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But looking at Sarah Whitmore, at the fierce determination in her eyes, even after she had pushed herself to the point of collapse, he felt something shift inside him. "How much help do you have?" he asked. "For running this place, I mean." "Just me and Jefferson, though his help is debatable most days. 60 acres is too much for one person to manage alone." "I am aware of that." Sarah's voice took on a defensive edge. "But I do not have money to hire help, and I will not marry some man who sees my land as more valuable than I am, so I manage. Until you collapse from heat exhaustion." That was the first time. "And if I had not been riding fence line today, if nobody had seen you fall?" Thomas leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "You could have died out there, Sarah." The sound of her name in his mouth sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. She looked away, fixing her gaze on the distant horizon. "Then I would have died trying to save what my father built. There are worse fates." "There are better ones, too." They sat in silence for a long moment, the heat of the day finally beginning to ease as the sun touched the horizon. Thomas knew he should head back to the Morrison Ranch, knew that the foreman would have questions about where he had been all afternoon, but he found himself reluctant to leave, unwilling to ride away and leave this woman alone with her impossible burden. "The field is plowed," he said finally, "but you still need to get the cotton planted. How long will that take you on your own?" 3 days, if the weather holds and nothing breaks. 2 days if you had help." Sarah turned to look at him, wariness and hope warring in her expression. "You have already done more than I had any right to expect. I cannot ask you to come back." "Then it is fortunate I am volunteering." Thomas stood and held out his hand to help her up. "I will be here tomorrow morning early before the worst heat sets in. We will get that cotton in the ground together." "Why?" Sarah asked, even as she took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, at the proud set of her shoulders despite her exhaustion, at the strength evident in every line of her body. He could not have explained his reasons if someone had put a gun to his head. He only knew that riding away and never seeing her again felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. "Maybe I am tired of drifting," he said quietly. "Maybe I want to see what happens when I stay in one place long enough to matter." Something in Sarah's chest cracked open at those words. Some wall she had built around herself after her father and brother died. She had been so alone for so long, convinced that accepting help meant admitting weakness, that needing anyone was the same as losing herself. But standing here in the fading light, her hand still in his, she thought maybe she had been wrong. "Tomorrow morning, then," she said softly. "Early." Thomas smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger and less weathered. "Tomorrow morning." He walked her back to the farmhouse, a small wooden structure that had seen better days but still stood solid and square against the Texas sky. Sarah assured him she felt well enough to manage on her own, and Thomas reluctantly mounted his horse and rode toward the Morrison ranch, looking back twice before she disappeared from view. Sarah stood on her porch and watched him go, one hand pressed against her chest where her heart beat faster than it had any right to. She told herself it was gratitude she felt, nothing more. But when she finally went inside and lay down on her narrow bed, it was Thomas McKenna's blue eyes she saw before sleep claimed her. True to his word, Thomas arrived at the Whitmore farm just after dawn the next morning. He had packed food from the ranch kitchen, claiming he needed supplies for riding the far pastures, and had told the foreman he would be gone for a few days checking on some fence repairs that did not actually need checking. The lie had come easily, which should have bothered him more than it did. Sarah met him at the barn, looking rested and considerably less flushed than she had the previous evening. She had braided her dark hair back from her face and wore a faded blue dress that had been patched in several places. Thomas thought she was the loveliest thing he had ever seen. They worked side by side through the morning, planting cotton seeds in the freshly turned earth. Thomas had brought seed bags from the Morrison ranch, claiming he would settle accounts later, and Sarah had been too grateful to question the gift too closely. The work went faster with two sets of hands, and they developed an easy rhythm, moving down the rows in companionable silence broken occasionally by brief exchanges. "You learned farming from your father?" Thomas asked as they paused to drink water in the shade of the barn. "Everything I know about working land came from him," Sarah said. "He was a good man. Fair and honest and harder working than anyone I ever knew. He bought this property 20 years ago when it was nothing but scrub brush and rattlesnakes. He built everything you see here with his own two hands. He would be proud of you, I think, fighting so hard to keep it." Sarah's eyes shone with sudden tears. "I hope so. Sometimes I wake up at night terrified that I'm failing him, that I'm going to lose everything he worked for because I am not strong enough or smart enough to hold on to it." "You are both those things, Harf," Thomas said firmly. "Anyone can see that." They returned to work, and the day passed in a blur of sweat and dirt and aching muscles. By the time the sun began its descent, they had planted nearly half the field. Sarah's hands were raw despite the gloves she wore, and Thomas's back screamed in protest every time he bent to drop seeds into the earth. But there was satisfaction in the work, a sense of shared purpose that neither of them had experienced in a long time. Sarah insisted on feeding Thomas dinner before he rode back to the Morrison ranch. She had little enough to offer, just beans and cornbread and coffee strong enough to strip paint, but Thomas ate like it was a feast in a fancy restaurant. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, and the silence between them felt comfortable, natural, like they had been sharing meals for years instead of days. "Will you really come back tomorrow?" Sarah asked as Thomas prepared to leave. "Do you want me to?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that went beyond planting cotton. Sarah met his eyes and saw her own uncertainty reflected there, along with something else. Something that made her pulse quicken. "Yes," she said simply. "I want you to come back." Thomas's smile was slow and warm. "Then I will be here." He rode away into the gathering darkness, and Sarah stood on her porch watching until she could no longer see him. She pressed her fingers to her lips, surprised to find herself smiling despite her exhaustion. The farmhouse felt less empty than it had in months. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Thomas arrived early each morning, and he and Sarah worked until the heat forced them to take shelter during the hottest part of the afternoon. They talked while they worked, sharing stories from their pasts, learning the shapes of each other's lives. Thomas told her about growing up in Arkansas, about losing his mother to cholera when he was 12, about his father drinking himself to death 2 years later. He described the ranches where he had worked, the cattle drives he had ridden, the towns he had passed through without looking back. Sarah shared her own history, painting pictures of her childhood on the farm, of her brother teaching her to ride, and her father teaching her to read. She spoke about the loneliness of the past few months, the crushing weight of responsibility, the fear that stalked her through sleepless nights. She found herself telling Thomas things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, truths she had barely admitted to herself. On the fourth day, they planted the last row of cotton just as storm clouds rolled in from the west. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they stood at the edge of the field, surveying their work. Sarah tilted her face up to the sky, letting the rain wash away days of accumulated dust and sweat, and laughed with pure relief. "We did it," she said, turning to Thomas with joy written across her face. "We actually did it." Thomas was staring at her with an expression that made her breath catch. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and darkened his shirt to his shoulders, but he did not seem to notice. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Sarah," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. She did not know who moved first. Maybe they both did, closing the distance between them in the same instant. His lips met hers as the rain fell harder, and Sarah felt something inside her chest expand and bloom like flowers after a drought. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and loneliness of the past months, and Thomas pulled her closer, holding her like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart hammering beneath her cheek. "I did not plan for this," she whispered. "Neither did I." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But I'm not sorry it happened. What do we do now?" "I suppose that depends on what you want." Sarah pulled back enough to look up at him, rain streaming down her face. "I want you to stay. Not just for today or tomorrow, but really stay. Help me run this farm, build something together. I want to stop being alone." "I have been drifting for 8 years," Thomas said slowly, "never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I convinced myself that I liked it that way, that roots were just another word for being trapped. But then I met you, and suddenly the idea of putting down roots does not sound like a trap anymore. It sounds like exactly what I have been searching for without knowing it." "Is that a yes?" Thomas kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise. "That is a yes." They ran for the house as the rain turned into a proper downpour, laughing like children, splashing through puddles forming in the yard. Inside, Sarah built up the fire while Thomas stripped off his soaked shirt and hung it to dry. They were both shivering, both grinning like fools, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Over the following weeks, Thomas moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse at the Morrison Ranch to the Whitmore farm. The foreman had been sorry to see him go, but understanding when Thomas explained that he had found a place worth staying for. The other ranch hands teased him mercilessly about being caught by a pretty face and a piece of land, but Thomas took the ribbing in good humor. They were not entirely wrong, after all, though they had the order backwards. It was Sarah first, always Sarah, and the land was simply part of the package. They worked together to repair the farmhouse roof before summer storms could cause real damage. Thomas proved handy with tools, and Sarah was quick to learn new skills. They fell into an easy partnership, dividing labor according to preference and ability rather than arbitrary notions about men's work and women's work. Thomas handled the heavy repairs and managed Jefferson, who had grudgingly accepted him as part of the household. Sarah kept the accounts, managed the kitchen garden, and made decisions about crop planting with Thomas's input. The cotton grew tall and green under regular rain and careful tending. Thomas had worried they might face judgment from neighbors about their living arrangement, but Sarah proved surprisingly unconcerned about gossip. "Let them talk," she said when he brought it up. "They were willing to let me die out here alone, so I do not much care what they think of how I choose to live." Still, Thomas could not shake the feeling that Sarah deserved better than whispers and sidelong glances. One evening in early July, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the darkening fields, he cleared his throat nervously. Sarah, I have been thinking. That sounds dangerous, she teased, then sobered when she saw his serious expression. What is it? We should get married. Sarah's heart skipped several beats. Is that a proposal or a practical suggestion? Both, maybe? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, suddenly uncertain. I know we have not been together long, and maybe this is too fast, but it feels right. You feel right. I want to build a life with you, Sarah. A real life. With both our names on the deed, and rings on our fingers, and no question about where we belong. You want to marry me for respectability? I want to marry you because I love you. The words came out fierce and certain. The respectability is just a bonus. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. You love me? How could I not? Thomas reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You are the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I have ever met. You make me want to be better, to build something that matters, to finally stop running and just be still. So yes, I love you. I think I started loving you the moment you tried to get up and go back to plowing even though you could barely stand. Sarah laughed through her tears. That might be the least romantic origin story for love I have ever heard. Does that mean you are saying no? That means I am saying yes, you fool. Sarah launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking them both off the porch. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I love you too. Yes to all of it. Thomas caught her and held on tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine that he would forever associate with home. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other under the vast Texas sky, making plans and promises in quiet voices. They were married 3 weeks later in San Antonio by a justice of the peace who seemed amused by their obvious impatience. Sarah wore a simple dress she had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had bought in town, and Thomas wore his only good shirt and a new pair of boots that pinched his feet terribly. They had no guests except for an elderly couple who served as witnesses, and the ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. It was perfect. The farm prospered under their combined efforts. The cotton came in strong that fall, and they made enough from the sale to buy supplies for winter and put a little money aside besides. Thomas proved to have a talent for horse trading, and he began buying wild Mustangs, breaking them to saddle, and selling them at a profit. Sarah expanded the kitchen garden into something substantial, selling vegetables in town and trading with neighbors for things they needed. The first winter was hard, but they faced it together. When a cold snap threatened to freeze the water pump, they took turns through the night keeping it working. When snow collapsed part of the barn roof, they repaired it side by side, their breath frosting in the frigid air. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small compromises and adjustments that turned two separate people into a partnership. By the following spring, the farm showed clear signs of their combined labors. The fields were neatly tended, the barn had been expanded to accommodate Thomas's growing string of horses, and the farmhouse had been improved with new windows and a front porch Thomas had built with his own hands. Sarah had painted the shutters blue, and flowers bloomed in boxes beneath the windows. On a warm evening in April, nearly a year after the day Thomas had found Sarah collapsed in the field, they sat together on that new porch, watching the sun set over land that belonged to both of them now. Sarah's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, and Thomas's arm was draped across her shoulders. I have been thinking about names, Sarah said quietly. Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. Have you now? If it is a boy, I would like to name him after my father, James. James McKenna, that has a good sound to it. And if it is a girl? Then you get to pick. I picked our last name after all. Sarah smiled and leaned into his warmth. I was thinking Clara, after your mother. Thomas went very still, and when Sarah looked up, she saw his eyes were bright with unshed tears. You would do that? She gave me you, Sarah said simply. Even if she is gone, I want to honor that. Thomas pulled her close and held her like she was the most valuable thing in the world. Have I mentioned today that I love you? Not in the last hour or so. Then I'm falling behind. He kissed her properly, taking his time about it. I love you. Sarah McKenna, I love the life we are building together. I love that I get to wake up every morning and know exactly where I belong. Even when Jefferson is being impossible? Even then. The baby came in late October, arriving during a brief cold snap that had everyone scrambling to protect the last of the garden vegetables. Sarah labored through the night with Thomas holding her hand and a midwife from town coaching her through each contraction. When dawn broke over the farm, a strong, healthy boy made his presence known with a wail that could probably be heard in the next county. James Thomas McKenna, Sarah said, exhausted and radiant, cradling the baby against her chest. Welcome to your home. Thomas looked at his son, at his wife, at the life they had created together from nothing but hard work and stubborn determination and love, and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was what he had been searching for during all those years of drifting. Not just a place, but a purpose. Not just land, but a legacy. Not just survival, but a reason to build something that would outlast him. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Clara, who had her mother's green eyes, and another son they called Daniel, who seemed determined to get into trouble from the moment he learned to walk. The farm continued to prosper, expanding slowly but steadily. They bought the adjacent 40 acres when the owner passed away, and Thomas built a larger barn to house his growing horse operation. James grew tall and strong, showing an early aptitude for working the land that would have made his grandfather proud. Clara proved to have her father's way with animals and spent more time in the barn than the house. Daniel split the difference, equally happy working fields or tending horses, though his real talent seemed to be making everyone around him laugh. Thomas never lost the wonder of waking up next to Sarah, never took for granted the gift of belonging somewhere completely. Sarah never forgot what it felt like to be alone, and she made sure Thomas knew every single day how grateful she was that he had stopped his horse that blazing afternoon and chosen to help a stranger in need. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Sarah into town and bought her a proper wedding ring to replace the simple band they had purchased a decade earlier. It was silver with a small diamond, nothing extravagant, but Sarah cried when he slipped it onto her finger. You did not need to do this, she said, admiring how it caught the light. I know, but I wanted to. I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that says you matter more to me than anything else in this world. Sarah kissed him there in the middle of the jewelry shop, unconcerned with propriety or who might see. I already knew that, but thank you just the same. They celebrated that night by leaving the children with a neighbor and riding out to the south field, the place where their story had begun. The cotton had been harvested weeks earlier, and the field lay peaceful and empty under a sky absolutely brilliant with stars. They spread a blanket on the ground and lay side by side, pointing out constellations and reminiscing about that first meeting. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked quietly. Giving up the drifting life? You saw so much of the world before you settled here. I saw places, Thomas corrected, but I never really saw anything worth remembering until I saw you. Everything before that day was just killing time until I found where I was supposed to be. That is a lot of pressure to put on one stubborn farmer. Thomas rolled onto his side and propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with eyes that still made her heart skip after 10 years together. You are not just a farmer. You are my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the only home I have ever really known. So no, Sarah, I do not regret a single moment. I would choose you again every single day for the rest of my life. Sarah pulled him down for a kiss that started tender and turned heated. They made love under the stars in the field where Thomas had first carried her to safety, and it felt like coming full circle, like closing a loop that had started the day she collapsed from heat exhaustion and a drifting cowboy decided to stay. The years continued their steady march. The children grew and began making their own choices about their futures. James announced his intention to stay on the farm and eventually take over operations, which filled both Thomas and Sarah with quiet pride. Clara shocked everyone by declaring she wanted to be a veterinarian, and Thomas mortgaged part of the farm to send her to school back east. Daniel proved to have a gift for numbers and started managing the farm's accounts before he was 15, finding ways to increase profits that neither of his parents would have thought of. Thomas's hair went gray at the temples, then silver all over. Sarah developed laugh lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of a life filled with joy despite its hardships. They both moved a little slower than they had in their youth, but they moved together, still partners in every sense of the word. On a warm spring afternoon, 30 years after the day they met, Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen garden, tending the tomato plants that she babied like they were made of gold. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, and she leaned back into him with the ease of long practice. "James brought his sweetheart by earlier," Sarah said. "The girl from the Miller farm. I think he means to propose soon." "Good. She's a hard worker, that one. She will be good for him." "It is strange, is it not? Our children building their own lives, making their own families. Sometimes I still feel like we just got started." Thomas turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "We have built something extraordinary here, Sarah. A real legacy. Your father would be so proud of what you have done with his land." "What we have done," Sarah corrected. "I could not have managed any of this without you. We made a good team. The best team." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by the results of decades of shared labor, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The farm would go on after them, passed down through their children and their children's children. The land that Sarah had fought so desperately to keep would remain in the family, just as her father had hoped. But more than that, they had built something together that transcended property lines and harvest yields. They had created a partnership based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of love that deepens and matures with time. They had proven that two people from different worlds could find common ground and build something lasting. As the sun set over the Texas farm that evening, Sarah and Thomas sat together on the porch they had built 3 decades earlier, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. James's oldest boy was chasing Clara's daughter around the oak tree Thomas had planted the year Daniel was born. The sound of children's laughter drifted on the evening air, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the familiar creak of the porch swing. "Do you remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, her hand finding Thomas's almost automatically. "Every detail. You were the most stubborn woman I had ever encountered, insisting you had to finish plowing even though you could barely stand. And you were the most stubborn man, refusing to take no for an answer when you insisted on helping." Thomas smiled and squeezed her hand. "I guess we were made for each other then. 2 stubborn fools who did not have the sense to quit when everyone else would have given up. I think that worked out pretty well for us." "Better than well. It worked out perfectly." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder and thought about the twist of fate that had brought them together. If she had not been so stubborn about finishing that field, if Thomas had not been riding fence line that particular afternoon, if he had not decided to stop and help a stranger in need, their entire lives would have been different. They would have remained apart, 2 separate people following 2 separate paths that never intersected, but all those pieces had fallen into place exactly as they were meant to. Sarah had collapsed from heat exhaustion. Thomas had carried her to shade and finished her plowing, and in doing so, he had finished plowing not just her field, but his own lonely furrow through life. He had found his place, his purpose, his home. And Sarah, who had fought so hard to hold on to her father's legacy alone, had learned that accepting help was not weakness, that letting someone share her burden did not diminish her strength, that love was not something to be feared or avoided, but embraced with both hands and a grateful heart. They sat together on that porch until the stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, content in their silence, complete in their togetherness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night, and Jefferson the mule, long since retired but still ornery as ever, brayed an answer from his pasture. Sarah laughed at the familiar sound, and Thomas pulled her closer, and the world felt exactly as it should. Their story had started with heat and exhaustion and desperation, with a woman alone who had pushed herself past the breaking point, and a man adrift who did not know he was searching for an anchor. It had bloomed into partnership and love, into children and grandchildren, into fields of cotton and strings of horses and a home built with their own hands and hearts. And as they finally stood to go inside, Thomas took one last look at the land spreading out before them in the moonlight, at the tangible proof of everything they had built together, and sent up a silent thank you to whatever force had guided him to ride that particular fence line on that particular day. He had been drifting for so long, convinced he was free, never understanding that what he called freedom was just another word for lost. Sarah had shown him the difference. She had given him roots when he did not know he needed them, purpose when he thought purpose was for other people, and love when he had convinced himself he was not the settling kind. She had given him everything, really, though she would never see it that way. Sarah would say they had given each other everything, that it was a partnership from the first moment, that neither of them was complete without the other. And maybe that was the real truth of it. Not that he had saved her or she had saved him, but that they had saved each other. Two broken pieces that fit together perfectly, creating something whole and strong and lasting. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah checked on the stew she had left simmering for supper while Thomas added wood to the fire. They moved around each other with the easy choreography of 3 decades together, not needing words to communicate. When the meal was ready, they sat at the same kitchen table where Thomas had first eaten Sarah's cooking all those years ago, and gave thanks for the food, the farm, the family, and most of all for each other. That night, lying in the bed they had shared for 30 years, Sarah curled into Thomas's side the way she always did, and Thomas wrapped his arms around her the way he always had. They were older now, slower, marked by time and hard work. But the fundamental core of what they were to each other had not changed. They were still partners, still best friends, still deeply, completely, absolutely in love. "I love you," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Thomas whispered back. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that until my last breath leaves my body." That is a long time. Not nearly long enough. Sarah smiled and closed her eyes, and as sleep claimed her, she thought about that terrible, wonderful day when she had collapsed in the field and a stranger had stopped to help. She thought about all the days that had followed, the struggles and triumphs, the heartaches and joys, the building of a life and a love that had exceeded anything she could have imagined in her darkest, loneliest moments. She had been so afraid of needing anyone, so convinced that independence was the same thing as strength, but Thomas had taught her that real strength was knowing when to accept help, when to lean on someone else, when to admit that you could not do everything alone. He had taught her that love was not a weakness to be guarded against, but a gift to be cherished and nurtured and protected with everything you had. And she had taught him what it meant to belong, to put down roots, to build something that mattered more than wandering freedom. She had shown him that staying was not the same as being trapped. That commitment was not a cage, but a foundation on which everything else could be built. Together, they had created something remarkable. Not perfect, because life was never perfect, but real and true and worth fighting for. They had taken 2 broken, lonely people and built a family, a farm, a future. They had turned heat, exhaustion, and desperation into love and legacy. And as the moon traced its path across the Texas sky and the farmhouse settled into the comfortable silence of night, Sarah and Thomas slept peacefully in each other's arms. 2 people who had found exactly what they needed in each other, their story complete, their love eternal, their happily ever after fully and finally realized.